Hi, today I'll be talking about How to Live Safely in a Science Fictional Universe by Charles Yu. I read this book with my local Lit and Wit book club, which I started with some friends from high school and some new friends. This was recommended by the beautiful and wonderful Brittany E. Um, I really enjoyed this book. It pretty much is about this time machine repairman that is looking for his father who disappeared. He invented the time machine. He disappeared out in the time-space continuum, and he's looking to reconnect with him. I particularly enjoy how he wrote this book. A lot of times it gets pretty tough trying to describe the entire science fictional landscape. However, I feel Charles Yu took a different approach in that in place of describing the entire scenery, he describes what the character is feeling. It's written in the first person, so the protagonist, who's named after this author, Charles Yu, he describes the way he feels, for example, when he first arrives to the time machine, the spaceship hub at the metropolis he goes to. So instead of describing just the minutia of all that's going on, of the sex bots, of the spaceships, of the aliens, he describes how he feels. In particularly, he describes how it feels to be back in experiencing time, first person, because when he's out doing his repair jobs, he just hangs out in space in his capsule. So he loses the concept and feeling of time. The way he describes it is, I had forgotten. This is what it feels like to live in time. The lurching forward, the sensation of falling off a cliff into darkness and then landing abruptly, surprised, confused, and then starting the whole process again in the next moment. Doing that over and over again, falling into each instant of time and then climbing back up only to repeat the process. I related with this description very much so in that as I go through the day, I tend to just find these checkpoints. Okay, time to do this task, time to go work out. Okay, now I'm back, time to eat breakfast. Okay, time to get ready. And it's just checkpoint after checkpoint after checkpoint, falling into each moment, getting back up, falling into each moment. And I tend to lose track of being in the moment because I am just looking forward to get to the next task. Okay, productivity, next task, checkpoint, checkpoint, checkpoint. So I felt he described that very well. I found that very relatable. Now, as he writes the book, he does weave in the science fictional part of it. And what I find entertaining is that he uses a lot of literary terms and applies them as if they're scientific principles. For example, he uses diegesis, which I had to look up, and he uses it as a critical part of time travel. And my understanding of diegesis is just the telling of the story. It's just the chronology of the story and how it unfolds. One particular principle he uses in describing time is that time is not linear, which actually is a concept I've been debating with personally a lot recently, on how the mind works in interpreting time, how the mind works in experiencing time. So the way he describes it is they are both perfectly valid ideas, necessary even to solve the problem your human brain has to solve. How to determine which events occur in what order. How to organize the data of the world into a sequence that appeals to your intuitions about causality. How to order the thin slices of your life so that they appear to mean something. You're looking out a window, a little porthole in fact, just like the one on the side of this time machine you're in. And out your window you see a little piece of the landscape. So this concept was actually originally introduced to me by Doctor Who, which is the series I love. In one of the episodes, the Doctor Who, the Time Lord, describes how humanity tends to misconceive the process of time and that we tend to see it as traveling from point A to point B. It's a very linear causality, to use the words of Charles Yu, when in fact time is actually just a knot of strings, a ball of yarn. It's just folded onto each other. Now, in order for us to have comfort in experiencing reality, in order for us to have comfort in experiencing time, we tend to just lay it out into this linear, logical order. It creates order for us from this seeming chaos. And Charles Yu proposes that that's exactly what the mind does. It determines which events occur in what order, and it figures out how to organize the data of the world into a sequence that appeals to your human intuitions. Now, this is still difficult for me to understand and trying to find the application behind this, but I did sympathize with it, and it did answer some questions for me that I've been wondering about time. More answers to come later. Now, before I go any further, as I was reading this book, I tended to find a lot of parallels in Charles Yu's principles with Buddhist teachings. And as I'm reading it and thinking that, I turn the page and sure enough, the protagonist's mother is Buddhist. And then, of course, later in the book, he gets shot in his time machine to this alternate non-time space reality, where he ends up in this temple, which turned out to be constructed by his father, who he's looking for, and his mother is there. But now this isn't his real mother. This is the mother his father had constructed, that he wanted his mother to be like. Now, this mother has been spending there in all eternity and in a Buddhist temple, just doing prayers, lighting incense. I'll get back to that later. Now, so as I came to this realization, and as I was talking to it a little bit more with my Lit and Wit book club, I began to realize that this book is actually an allegory to present Buddhist principles. For example, the time machine is an allegory for the human mind and how the human mind interprets time and how the human mind travels through time. The father he's looking for is actually the God source Buddhists talk about, and trying to reconnect back with that source, which what Charles Yu, the protagonist, is doing in the story. And finally, the temple that he visits is an allegory for religion and the role religion plays in, one, reconnecting with your divine source, and two, experiencing your spirituality. And once again, I'll get back to this temple later. Now, to be more specific on the Buddhist principles outlined by Charles Yu, subtly, mind you, to start off, in the beginning of the book, he describes the foundational theory of chronodiegetics, which is, in the book, the theory of time travel. Within a science fictional space, memory and regret are, when taken together, the set of necessary and sufficient elements required to produce a time machine. Okay, he talks about this again towards regret in that he says, do you want to know what the first stop usually is when someone first rents out a time machine? Take a guess. Don't guess. You already know. The unhappiest day of their life. Which is very true. The human mind tends to revisit old wounds, to pick at them. They don't let ghosts die through regret. And there's a Taoist proverb that says it wonderfully, in that if you're filled with regret, that's because you're dwelling on the past. If you're filled with anxiety, that's because you're dwelling on the future. So come back to the present, experience the presence. And Charles Yu repeats that throughout the book. Now, of course, he does offer solutions to this and emollients to the suffering that we self-inflict. He states, if you're not careful, time will take away everything that ever hurt you, everything you ever lost, and replace it with knowledge. Time is a machine. It will convert your pain into experience. Raw data will be compiled, will be translated into a more comprehensible language. It's comforting. It's comforting to know that, and that's what Buddhism teaches, is it's the attachment to the past, to your regret, that causes this suffering. When in fact, you should be using time as a tool to heal, to convert your pain into experience, to replace everything you lost with knowledge. And that's what Buddhism tries to teach. There's another quote he uses. And in that process, Buddhism talks about how the mind, through regret, through memory, will create an illusion and distort on how you remember it. He writes that again here, where in the story arc, the time machine repairman, Charles Yu, gets stuck into this time loop because he kills himself. He kills this future self, therefore he has no future, and he gets stuck into this time loop. Part of this time loop is his future self gives him this book that he wrote. So it gets into this whole mind screw where, you know, how could he have written this book if he killed himself? And anyways, so the source of this book is never really understood. So he elaborates on it a little bit, in that the book is a perfectly stable physical object that actually exists, despite the fact that it seems to come from nowhere. You know, the source isn't understood. Less certain is whether human memory works the same way. So I thought what he was getting at is that human memory tends to invent things, and you don't really understand what, how these inventions came to be, but you know they exist. For example, I recently had a strange beginning of the year in where I was revisited by past flames. And part of that is each of them, past romantic flames, and each of them shared with me their perspective on our past relationship. And as they were telling this to me, and I even told this to two of them, in that I don't remember it unfolding that way. I don't remember us having that type of dynamic. And I felt Charles Yu was referring to that here, in that memory, the mind creates illusions what it wants to see. And it creates these thought forms, these beliefs, these mentalities where you don't know where they came from, but you just believe they exist, and they do exist. Moving on from memory, Charles Yu also talks about oneness, which is a very big cornerstone of Buddhist teachings. One of the metaphors he uses is the theory of the photon. So a photon is a unit of energy. It's much like light, so light is made up of light photons. And Charles Yu describes how scientists believe that photons travel from point A to point B, right? So photons travel from the sun and they hit the table. Okay, then the photons reflect from the table, hit my eye, and that's how I see the table. Okay, now he says that scientists theorize that a photon traveling from A to B will actually travel through every possible path before getting to point B, until finally getting to point B. So along that vein, what he talks about is how certain scientists theorize that there's actually only one photon in existence, and that photon is traveling everywhere from whatever source to whatever destination. And that is how we are able to see. And that touches on the Buddhist concept of oneness, that we are all one, and we are all made up of this same ethereal cosmic source fabric. And what they a lot of times say is we are just the universe experiencing itself. So I am you, you are me, I am the book, I am the plant, the animal, and it's just the universe re-experiencing itself. Now, additionally, going towards the conclusion, as Charles Yu is experiencing this time loop, he begins to rationalize, along with the help of Tammy, his computer system in the time machine. He begins to cultivate a relationship with himself versus seeking his father. And that very much so is, once again, a Buddhist thought in becoming present with yourself, developing your relationship with yourself. And at that point, he begins to not want to look for his father anymore, not to look for his source. Buddhist monks, they'll ask you to change your attention from God towards yourself, in reference to the presence now, to cultivate that relationship with yourself, to cultivate the virtues with yourself, and to experience your own divinity. And that's how you essentially find God. That's how you find your divinity. That's how you find your father, and to go along with the story arc. In opposition to that, what we tend to do is we tend to compartmentalize our life instead, to create this separateness. And he talks about it a little bit here, in that, so he's arguing with his computer system, Tammy, and I'll just go ahead and read it. So that's my future self. That's my future self. Listen to you. You sound like an idiot. Who do you think you are? Imagine there's a version of you that sees all of it. A version that knows when versions are messing with the other ones, trying to get things off track, trying to erase things. A record of all the keystrokes, the storage of all the versions, partial and deleted and written over. All the changes. All truths about all parts of ourselves. We break ourselves up into parts to lie to ourselves, to hide things from ourselves. You are not you. You are not what you think you are. You are bigger than you think. And he talks about it earlier in the book on how we just create these boxes and boxes and boxes, these roles to interact with different people in our lives. And Buddhism teaches contrary to that, that you are not consistent of these roles, you are not consistent of these small compartments. It's time to discover your oneness. It is time to discover your God source to get to the conclusion, by experiencing the now. And that's at page 226, he finally gets to it. He finally gets to how to properly experience time. He writes, if instead of looking forward or back, we could do the opposite. If we could see from the outside looking in from all sides, if we could only look inward into the black box of right now. If I could get him to do that, he would understand. He would know what I know, which is that it's not necessarily going to be okay. In fact, it probably won't. Once again, Buddhism talks about how the objective of humanity is to get rid of attachment. By getting rid of attachment, you can escape suffering. Now, they're not necessarily saying that once you escape suffering, once you experience the now, you'll escape all suffering. No, suffering is a natural part of life. It's not necessarily going to be okay. In fact, it probably won't. If I can convince him to do that, then he would know what I know. And then I would have what he has, which is the freedom to act, the chance to do something different, to exert my own will, to not be afraid to let myself move forward into the next moment. I would have what he has, which is the possibility of not doing what I have done countless times, just continuing on in my own time loop. And that's the entire objective that Buddhism teaches. To experience the now, to stop looking back at the past. Yes, an individual is the sum of their events, but using that as a tool to heal, to gain knowledge, to gain experience. And from that part, being able to experience your creativity, find your divinity, and create this authorship in your life. That being okay with suffering is going to happen. Suffering creates knowledge, suffering creates experience. However, letting go of that attachment to suffering and resurfacing these wounds, reliving these limited beliefs so that you can find your Father, find your God source, which, once again, is just always inward. So yes, I recommend this book. It's an easy read, short read. It gets it bogs you down a little bit in the beginning just because of he lays out the scientific rules at the beginning, but once you get past that, it gets really juicy once he gets to the future metropolis. So I recommend you just pick it up.